Princeton and just PhD at Harvard with Jason Mitchell, and then went back to Princeton to work with Diane Tamir as a postdoc. And he, as I think we've already mentioned this, he was in our inaugural Mind as a participant, and then he kind of blew our minds with how many projects we did in such a short amount of time. That was actually a shorter summer school than we have now. It was only 5 days, and he did 3 projects. We're like, you should come back and help us next year as a faculty. So we did that, and then we were kind of so blown away by how well we did with that. We're like, you know what? You should apply for a job here. And so I'm pleased to announce that he's going to start here next year in our department as a faculty and kind of continue this tradition. So please help me welcome Mark.
Thanks very much, Luke, and thank you all for your attention. I'm going to talk to you today about some work which I've done over the past several years investigating the way we organize social knowledge and use it in social life. Humans have an incredibly rich social world to navigate. We do a huge number of different things with one another. We run and we jump, we sing and we dance, we cook food for other people to eat, we govern nations and construct buildings and conduct scientific research. And we do this with people who differ from one another in an incredibly wide variety of ways, both on a short time scale in terms of their momentary mental states, and on a long time scale in terms of their personality traits. And somehow we have to organize this incredibly rich sea of information so that we can effectively interact with other people to achieve our goals. And as we've heard a lot about over the course of this summer school so far, maps are incredibly powerful ways to organize knowledge. And instead of organizing physical knowledge, like the locations of places, the maps I study organize social knowledge, like the concepts of different mental states. And what I try and do is identify the cardinal dimensions, the longitude and latitude lines, which structure these maps of the social world. In the first part of my talk today, I'm going to focus on what these maps look like, how we can chart these multidimensional maps of social space. And in the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk about what these maps are good for, in particular how they can be used to make accurate predictions about the social world. Our starting place for this was the idea that there are different types of social information, different layers of social knowledge that are important for us to master. These include knowledge of people's enduring personality traits. So this is a little bit like the person space sort of idea that Daniela talked about earlier in her talk. We also need to understand people's momentary mental states, how they think and feel in a given moment, which can differ quite a lot from their habitual personality traits. And finally, we need to understand what people are specifically doing, what they intend to do, and how they can cooperate with us or potentially hinder us in our own actions. And each of these, we think, has some different organizational structure to them. And I'm going to take you through the research we've done to try and identify what those organizational structures look like. We're going to begin by taking the case of traits. And as Daniela actually nicely set up, there are a lot of different traits theories already out there in the social psychological literature. A few prominent examples include the stereotype content model, which she mentioned, that organizes people in terms of these dimensions of warmth and competence. The 5-factor model of personality, although it's more thought of as a model of personality than a person perception. Most of it's validated based on people's judgments of themselves and other people, so it can also be thought of as a map of how people think about the social world in terms of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and eroticism of the people they know. Gray and Wegner's map of mind perception is another good example of one of these dimensional theories. This posits that there are 2 dimensions, agency and the capacity for emotional experience, which determines whether we attribute a mind to another entity at all. So for example, adult humans might have both of these qualities, but God might only have agency, and something like a fetus might only have a capacity for experience. And then finally, Alex Chodorov's model, which has also been mentioned previously, which posits that most of the inferences we draw from people's faces can be boiled down to just these 2 dimensions of trustworthiness and dominance. And so what we wanted to find out is, can the dimensions from these theories allow us to explain which people we think of as similar or different from one another, what our map of trait space looks like. In particular, we wanted to look at this set of individuals. So this is a set of 60 famous people that we very carefully selected from the broader set of well-known public individuals using a combination of web scraping and text analysis and human judgments to try and get a set that was sufficiently well-known that most of our participants would know something about all these people in advance, but also also within that criteria as diverse as possible. And diversity here defined in terms of which people judge as being similar or different, which is maybe not a normative model of diversity, but is descriptive in a useful way. And of course, there are advantages and disadvantages to using famous people as stimuli. The main advantage is that these are common reference points in our social space. Insofar as we all know these people and sort of think about them similarly based on what we know from public media, we have similar impressions of them all. That allows us to distribute our data collection across many different participants. If one participant did all of the different parts of the study I'm going to tell you about, it would have taken them about 20 hours, which we thought was a little bit too onerous to put on the back of any one person. So this is now going to have separate imaging participants and separate raters online and things like that, which you can't really do with personally familiar others, for example. We have done some separate work with personally familiar others, which I'm not going to get into today, but I'm happy to answer some questions about that if people have it. And by mapping the social space, we really need to include people from every part of that social space. So it's really important that we sample appropriately. You get a really distorted map of the world, for example, if you just cut off the southern hemisphere and mapped whatever was left. So similarly, we wanted to try and cover this space of people as well as we could with these target individuals. But what we found when we asked participants to rate each of these individuals on the dimensions of the various psychological theories I mentioned a moment ago is that these nominally distinct theories actually make very similar overlapping predictions. And in fact, almost all of them can be boiled down to just 3 psychological dimensions. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in my tutorial this afternoon on dimensionality reduction. But we found one dimension, which similarly we called power, which loads highly on dimensions like dominance and conscientiousness and agency. Another we called valence, but is a little bit similar to affiliation that you heard about earlier. Loads highly on things like warmth and agreeableness and trustworthiness. And finally, a third dimension, sociality, which mainly maps onto to extroversion, how much people like to engage with others socially. And so what we wanted to see was, can we take these 3 psychological dimensions, this map of social space, and explain what happens in your brain when you try and make inferences about other people, specifically those famous people I mentioned a moment ago. So we presented an fMRI experiment of the following form to participants. On each trial, they'd see the name of a particular famous person, and they'd see some statement which might or might not apply to that person. In this case, how much Bill Nye likes karate. They'd rate on a 1 to 5 scale. We tried to choose items here which were things that could be reasonably inferred based on what they'd likely know about these individuals, but not things that they'd actually know for a fact. So we wouldn't ask, is Bill Nye the science guy, because that's just an explicit fact that people would presumably know. This is... This is something which then they could probably infer from his personality, but not know explicitly. And participants would see many, many different preference items like this for each of our different participants, and we'd average across every presentation of a particular target person to generate a stable pattern of brain activity associated with Bill Nye and with each of the other 60 individuals in the study. And we could then identify where in the brain there were reliable patterns of activity associated with thinking about these different individuals. So this is the result of a reliability-based feature selection procedure, which maximizes the reliability of the pattern within the retained voxels at a particular threshold of voxel-wise reliability. Talia Kunkel just put out a really awesome paper on this method, which I highly recommend checking out if you haven't already. And so within these regions, which you can see are very much the sort of social brain regions which other people have talked about, including medial prefrontal cortex, medial parietal cortex, temporal parietal junction, and aspects of the anterior temporal lobe, we see these very reliable patterns associated with thinking about these different individuals. So we want to try and explain those patterns within these regions using our psychological dimensions. And in this case, the tool we used to do that was an encoding model. So this is a very simple illustration of what this encoding model looked like. I'm only showing 2 of the 3 dimensions here for simplicity and visualization. So each one of our famous people would occupy some particular point within this space. And thanks to our imaging experiment, we also had a pattern of brain activity associated with each of these individuals. And the encoding model was effectively just a regression, or even a weighted average, if you will, where we would take a weighted average of all the individual patterns based on their position on a particular dimension. So we'd weight, for example, Barack Obama very highly on power, Justin Bieber a lot lower on power, and add them all up into this prototypical power pattern. This is what your brain would presumably look like if you thought about the most powerful possible person. And we can do the same thing for each of our dimensions to generate a prototypical pattern associated with each of them. And then we could present the model with a left-out target person, in this case Putin, and we try and reconstruct the Putin pattern by mixing together these prototypical patterns based on Putin's location within this space. And of course, we actually did collect the Putin pattern. We just held it out of the model training. And so we could compare the reconstruction to the actual pattern to determine whether we could, in fact, capture the variance associated with thinking about Putin and with each of our target persons left out in turn. What we found when we did this is that together, these three trait dimensions could describe 67% of the reliable neural variance associated with thinking about these different famous individuals. So here you can see a literal physical map of the brain's map of these famous people. Yeah. Yeah, so this is basically the pattern reconstruction accuracy, which is measured by a correlation between the left out and the reconstructed pattern, as a fraction of a noise ceiling calculated by taking the average pattern from other participants and applying that to a held out participant. So basically, of the variance that a perfect theory could hope to explain, we're explaining 2/3 of it. And so this is a map where, made by multidimensional scaling, another technique I'll talk about in my tutorial later today, where the distance between people is proportional to how similar their neural patterns that they elicit are. So for example, Justin Timberlake and Cameron Diaz elicit very similar patterns of brain activity, which is very different to the one elicited by Albert Einstein. And you can see these vectors, which are called biplots in this instance, which indicate how the axes of this graph are correlated with each of these different sort of cardinal dimensions. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So this is a really deep problem, which is like, what is the canonical orientation of a map? If you look at a map of the globe, for example, you are expecting to see it, with the north in the top. But there's nothing really special about that. You could actually have it pointing the other way, and I prefer that because I came from New Zealand originally, and so I think New Zealand should be the top of the world. But but identifying what the canonical direction of a map is actually quite a challenging task. So effectively, any orthogonal rotation of these dimensions would explain just as well as these particular dimensions. But we have nice names for these, where we don't have names for maybe like valence plus power or something like that. So I think this is a useful description. Yeah. Yes? These are just factor scores from a PCA. We've subsequently validated those, but what you're seeing right here are just based on the PCA factor scores.
So there is a situation where you did ask people to grade them?
Yes, yeah.
And is the variance along these different dimensions similar, or is it more variance, for instance, along, I don't know, let's say sociality or power compared to valence and such?
I couldn't answer that, unfortunately, based on the subsequent ratings of these things. In the original set of dimensions, power is accounting for the most, but that's sort of determined by what original feature dimensions we included, so I don't want to draw a strong conclusion based on that, necessarily. Yeah, why do you?
Because then the dimensions and the sort of the structure of the space would be different, more towards one dimension or another.
Right, yeah, I mean,
Encoding sort of models might be sort of using dimensions differently with different basic parameter estimates.
right, yeah. So I mean, you can see that to some extent even in this graph, where like this is somewhat distorted because it's a two-dimensional representation of three dimensions. But you can see that power, for example, is actually much more correlated with sort of the axes of this graph, so explaining more of this space than, say, valence is, because it's a shorter vector. So this gives us some. Maybe I'll hold off on a couple questions for the moment, just so I can make it through a couple more of these maps, and some of the questions may be answered as I progress through this in terms of the methods. So this gives us some idea of what our map of person space organized in terms of traits might look like. But this is not the only type of social stimulus that's really important for us to understand. Another type which we've looked at in a great deal amount of detail is our map of mental state space, of thoughts and feelings space. And we started here, again, trying to very carefully sample from this space with a set of 60 minimally redundant mental states that sort of cover a lot of different dimensions uniformly. And so you can see those here. And we wanted to see, can dimensions from existing psychological theories explain the way that people think about the concept of thought and trance and disarray and awe and so forth. And what we found was that from 16 different dimensions derived from psychological theories, we identified just 4 principal components. The first one we called rationality, which distinguishes more cognitive states from more emotional states. Those highly on experience and emotion and low on competence and reason. Social impact, which is highly correlated with sociality of a state and the physiological arousal of a state, and of course in the opposite direction with the polar opposites of those two. So you can see examples of those there. Valence, just positive versus negative states, and then a fourth dimension we called human mind, which distinguishes uniquely human and purely mental states from states that we may share with other animals or which have some somatic component. And so we wanted to see whether these four dimensions could be used to construct a map of mental state space. And so in an fMRI experiment, we asked a separate group of participants to make judgments about mental states. So participants would see the name of one of the 60 states, and two scenarios we pre-tested to elicit that. These two work really well for me, but we showed more appropriate ones for participants, obviously. And then this would repeat over and over again across the course of the experiment so that we could estimate stable patterns of activity associated with each of the 60 different mental states. And in this case, we used representational similarity analysis to try and quantify how much each of these different dimensions could predict the patterns of neural activity. So we'd predict, for example, that if two mental states are very close together on a dimension, they should elicit similar patterns, and if they're very far apart on a dimension, they should elicit very different patterns. If you want to read more about that, you can check out my mountain tutorial from last year, which is on RSA. And so we're looking within these sets of regions, which are very similar to those we identified in the person perception case, which seem to have reliable activity associated with thinking about different mental states, including, again, medial prefrontal and parietal cortices, TPJ, and ATL. And what we find is that three of the four psychological dimensions we investigated seem to be predicting the neural pattern similarity between these different mental states, rationality, social impact, and valence. This original study had about 20 people in it. We've subsequently run a number of different studies, so we have a total sample size now of 113 participants who have done different versions of the study. We recently threw all these into a mega-analysis, which is a participant-level meta-analysis, and we see, even across this much larger set, that all three of these dimensions are significant predictors of the neural pattern similarity between different mental states. And in fact, we've now looked across 58 different competing dimensions, and these three are the best combination of any of those 58 at explaining the neural pattern similarity. So we've ruled out a lot of different possibilities which might change what our map looks like. And together they explain 80% of the shared neural variance. So in terms of the variance which is shared across your brain and my brain and across many different studies, we're explaining about 80% of our common map of mental state space. This doesn't really get the idiosyncrasies, which could also be really interesting, but at least in terms of the shared map, this is explaining quite a good deal of it. The final map I'll talk only very briefly about is one that we've been investigating recently, how we think about other people's actions. And it's really important, of course, to understand what people are doing, not just why they're doing it or what kind of person they are, in order to anticipate what they're likely to do next and to be able to shape our own behavior accordingly to either help them or foil them or achieve some other goal. And the way we started by investigating this was to look at Reddit, which some of you may recognize here. So Reddit's a news forum aggregator where people comment on lots of different things on the internet. So this is actually about some of the fires in California a while ago, and how a dog escaped. And there's this very suspenseful moment about whether the dog actually made it out of the fire or not, or it did. So don't worry. There's thanks for the pup date at the bottom there. It's my favorite part of this. And so what we did in this set of about 10 million Reddit comments was to measure the co-occurrence of verbs, which are used as proxies for actions, with nouns, which are treated as proxies for either the objects over which those actions are being performed or the people performing the actions. And we used this in combination with PCA to extract a set of feature dimensions. So what this would look like, for example, is finding all of the verbs in a particular sentence and all of the nouns in that sentence, and adding those to a big table where the verbs are on the rows and the nouns are on the columns, and then doing PCA over that table after we've aggregated it over across all of these different comments. And subsequently, we honed this down over the course of 9 experiments, which I'm not going to tell you about in detail today because it's a little bit much. But we ultimately ended up with this 6-dimensional model, which we call the abstraction, creation, tradition, food, animacy, and spiritualism taxonomy, or ACT FAST. These 6 dimensions explain a lot of different aspects of how people think about actions. For example, whether they're more abstract social actions or concrete physical actions, whether they involve making something or destroying buying or taking something, whether they involve food or not, really critical dimension. Let's try to be conscious of time so that you don't start thinking about the food dimension too much towards the end of my talk. And these dimensions do a lot for us. Just very briefly, they explain how we talk and write about different actions. They explain which actions people judge are similar or different to one another. They explain really useful real-world features of actions, such as the sort of who, why, when, where, and how different actions are thought to be performed. And they also predict, most relevant to us since we're neuroscientists, the spontaneous neural activity elicited by viewing these actions in a naturalistic stimulus, in particular the Sherlock dataset from Janice Chen, which some of you may know. So this gives us now 3 really good maps of social space. Maps of the types of people that are out there, maps of the things those people are feeling internally, and maps of the things those people are doing externally. And the question I want to turn to now is what these maps are actually good for. Why do we bother to represent all of the social information? And I think the answer to that comes in the form of prediction, and in particular a very precise hypothesis which Christian Doller's talk may have presaged in some way, which is that we think that distance within these spaces is proportional to the transitional probabilities between these different stimuli. So the closer two mental states are in mental state space, the more likely one is to go from one mental state to another, and similarly in action space, the closer two actions are, the more likely one is to transition from one action to the next. And we've tested this hypothesis in both of these domains now, as I'll tell you about briefly. So let's start with the case of mental states. In the domain of mental states, we measured the ground truth in a slightly different way than you do in a domain like the physical world, because it's a little trickier to figure out what the ground truth is. Navigating to a particular place, there's sort of an objective answer that we'd all agree on. In respect to emotions, we instead turn to experience sampling studies. We've heard a little bit sort of about experience sampling, for example, in Megan's talk, where people would periodically report on how they're feeling. We drew on 4 existing data sets of very different characteristics, some small college samples, some really big samples of French and Belgian people, and about 2 million people who periodically reported their emotions on the Experience Project, which is an online platform for sharing people's experiences. And there are lots of different methodological details on how often people reported and whether they were being prompted or not, as well as what particular states they were reporting on. But across all these studies, the effective paradigm would be that people would report on their emotions at one moment in time, and at some moment in time they'd report on their emotions again, and we could simply tabulate the transition from one emotion to the next emotion to figure out which emotions were more likely and which emotions were less likely. What's the transitional probability between all the emotions within a particular data set? So this gives us some measure of ground truth, what actually happens in people's daily experiences in real life. And so we wanted to elicit predictions that would parallel this. And we did this in a very sort of stripped down, decontextualized task that would basically not give people any of the context they normally have. Only information they provide is that somebody is currently experiencing a particular mental state, and they'd be asked to rate how likely that person is to next experience some other state. So this could be happiness and anger, for example. And we'd collect this for all the pairs of emotions that people reported on in the parallel experience sampling study. So for each of these experience sampling transitional probabilities, we would have a matched rated transitional probability between the same pair of states. And we'd simply correlate these two things together to see if people were accurate. And what we saw in study after study after study is that indeed there is this really robust positive association between which mental state transitions people think are likely, which is shown here on the x-axis, and which ones are in fact likely in people's lived experience, shown here on the y-axis. So people seem to be accurate about which emotion transitions are more or less likely. And that's an important first step because there's nothing to explain if people aren't accurate in the first place. But now we wanted to see whether our map of mental state space could help explain what was going on here, how people were able to achieve this accuracy. And as I mentioned previously, our hypothesis was that the further apart two states were within the mental state space, the less likely a transition would be between them. And that's what you're seeing here in these 3 graphs. So the further a state is away from another state, so each one of these points represents one pair of states. So these pairs of states would be really far apart. These ones would be really close together. And this is the transitional probability between them on the y-axis. And you can see in each case there's a significant negative slope, though varying based on which dimension it is, between how likely people think a transition is and what the distance is between them. So indeed, the proximity within the space seems to be predicting the transitional probabilities. Yeah?
Looks like there's a cool effect of variance also as a function of distance.
Yeah. So like there are relatively few of the transitions out here in long distance space, basically. Yeah.
Do you make anything of that?
Not yet, but if you have ideas, I'd love to hear them. um, yeah. So these are Spearman's rows, partially to control for the fact that there's like a really skewed distribution here, and it's all positive and that sort of thing. Yeah, and so this is showing people's ratings of the transitional probabilities between mental states, but you see the exact same pattern with respect to the experience transitions from the various data sets, and in fact, the dimensions mediate the statistical relationship between the two of them. So the shared variance between what people think is likely to happen and what's actually likely to happen, in other words, their accuracy, can be statistically explained in part by the proximity between mental states on these dimensions. So we investigated a similar question with respect to actions very recently over the course of 5 pre-registered studies we conducted, each one of them trying to, again, match up a type of ground truth measure for how likely an action transition was with a judgment from a human of how likely they thought that action transition was. So here you can see how we generated one particular type of ground truth. So we turned to the American Time Use Survey. This is a really big nationally representative survey conducted every year by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, in which participants will report on their activities over the course of a diary day. So this is sort of a hypothetical example of what somebody might report for a given day, that they're sleeping for a nice 8 hours, and they get up and brush their teeth and take a shower, and then they have breakfast and go to work and do their work and eat some for lunch, go back to work, socialize with some friends before going home, and then help take care of the kids. And we'd have these measures for each of these different 180,000 people which reported on this, and we could simply tabulate how likely someone was to go from one particular activity to the next to estimate the transitional probabilities between them. So this is an example of what one of those transitional probabilities matrices would look like. This is the coarsest one, which is why I'm showing it to you, because they're the fewest labels, and even then it's quite a lot. But for some of the other ground truth measures I'll tell you about in a moment, we have a much sort of finer grained, both conceptual and temporal upperization of the action space. But you can see there's a lot of interesting structure in this. So for example, there's this what we call a sticky diagonal, where people tend to go from one action of a particular class to another action of that same class. There are exceptions in interesting cases, like for eating and drinking. People aren't likely to have a meal and then go immediately have another meal, which you'd expect to be the case. And of course, there's also interesting off-diagonal structure, such that people are likely to go from one activity to another activity in some cases and not in others. And so what we want to see is, do people have accurate intuitions about this? Can they predict these action transitions accurately or not? And very similar to the emotion transition study, we simply asked people to make these transitions. Is somebody who's currently doing X, where X could be sleeping, likely to next engage in eating or drinking or running or some other action? And people just rate this on a 1 to 100 scale. And here's a plot of the particular data from the American Time Use Survey, where you see the rated likelihood of transitions on the x-axis and the ground truth again on the y-axis, and there's this nice positive association between the two. You can see that there's like weird end to the distribution here. This is actually the sticky diagonal that's popping up here, and people aren't completely anticipating that. So this is still actually a stronger relationship, I think, if you take that out. And people actually have even more nuanced predictions, like you can just look at the asymmetries in the transitional probability matrix, and people are still accurate with respect to those asymmetries. So one action is likely to precede another, but not vice versa. So people have some pretty nuanced understanding of this. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so for the mental states and the actions, you're treating them as classes, right? So if you're eating, you're not socializing. And there's only like one amount of traveling you could do, or one amount of anger you could feel.
Right. That is true. That is true of this particular ground truth data set. That's not actually true of the ground truth that we collected in most cases. So for example, in the emotional experience sampling studies, people could report as many emotions as they wanted, and we could just tabulate all the transitions from one step to the next. So yeah, that's not a general property of these data, I'd say. We looked at a number of other different types of ground truth to get convergent validity for this sort of finding. So we looked at movie scripts from IMSDB, which I know some groups here have been working with the hackathon, looking at which verbs were mentioned in a particular spoken line of dialogue and which ones were mentioned in later lines of dialogue. We looked at wikihow.com, which contains at least nominally normative sequences of actions to achieve some particular goal. And so again, we'd look at like what verbs were mentioned in a particular step of those instructions and which ones were mentioned in the next step of the instructions to see which transitions were more or less likely there. And finally, we also used annotated video data sets. This is the atomic video actions data collected by or annotated by Google, in which people would report on which actions are present in video at a 3-second temporal resolution, which is a lot finer than what most of these other data sets are working with. So we have a pretty broad range of different types of action annotations here. But despite the variability between them across all these studies, we see the same positive relationship between what people think are the likely transitions and which transitions are actually likely between actions. So people seem to have some pretty robust intuition about which action transitions are more or less likely. And this is just the item analysis data, of course. So this is averaging across participants, but individual participants too have very accurate, well, not very accurate, but very consistently accurate perceptions of action transitions. So just like in the previous case, we wanted to see whether we could explain this action based on the psychological map of action space that we'd put together. And so this is, again, effectively a mediation analysis where we're trying to see if the relationship, the accuracy relationship between perceived and actual transitional probabilities can be statistically explained away by the proximity between actions on the act-fast dimensions. And so we simply had participants rate each of the actions on each of these dimensions for each study, and calculated the proximity between them and entered these into a regression to see if they weakened the partial correlation effectively between these two variables. And what we saw here was, again, across all 5 studies and combining across them all, if you want to do a little mini meta-analysis, the proximity indeed statistically mediates the association between the perceived transitional probabilities and the actual transitional probabilities. This doesn't fully explain away people's accuracy, and there are interesting aspects we can't really explain quite yet with the map. So for example, how people are accurate at anticipating the asymmetric transitions is a little tricky when you have a Euclidean space. We have some ideas for how to tackle that, but we haven't actually tested any of them empirically yet. So this gives us more evidence that, in fact, these psychological maps are allowing us to make accurate social predictions about the world. And we've started recently to investigate connections between different layers as well. So one recently published example investigated how the trait layer may be built up from the state layer. Basically finding that people seem to be encoding traits as the sums of people's habitual mental states. You can tell where people are going to be within this trait space really well by figuring out what kinds of emotions they chronically experience, or are thought to chronically experience at least. And in fact, you can add up patterns of brain activity associated with mental states and reconstruct a pattern of brain activity associated with a particular person based on weighting the mental state patterns from how often those people experience them. In some ongoing research, we're trying to map out additional domains of social knowledge. So one study going on right now is trying to understand how people represent situations. Situations, of course, from a psychological perspective, are a really important domain of social knowledge, and situations differ from one another in systematic ways. There are actually a number of existing dimensional taxonomies already out there, which we're again trying to synthesize and test using neural data for the first time. And we're trying to, again, see whether these are useful for making predictions. In this case, predictions about which actions are likely to be forwarded by a particular situation. This is an old ecological psychology theory that suggests that what a situation effectively is just the sum of the action affordances it offers to people. So we're trying to test that directly in terms of people's representations of actions and situations. We're also looking at how culture can potentially modulate the shape of these maps. So this is data from a text analysis where we scraped about 170 million tweets from 60-odd countries with substantial English-speaking populations. And we fit a text embedding model to them and then tried to predict the similarity between representations of mental state words based on their proximity on the 3 dimensions of our model or the 2 dimensions of the circumplex model of affect. And you can see that although the extent to which these dimensions predicted is quite variable across different countries, almost every country that we investigated is showing a positive effect, such that these dimensions are to some extent explaining how people are thinking about the mental states, or at least how they're using mental state words in their language. And this is not just true for English speakers in a bunch of countries. This is true across different languages. We've looked at 10 languages, hoping to get up to 16 as soon as our translators get back to us. And nearly all the languages seem to be showing the effects of these dimensions. We've also been looking, and this is something that you can't really do with traditional cross-cultural psych methods, but you can do with text analysis, is looking at historical cultures as well. So cultures which are in some sense no longer extant, still may leave a written record. And so, for example, we've looked at a corpus of ancient Chinese, and we've seen the same three dimensions predicting almost to the same extent as in English, how mental state words co-occur in a totally different writing system written by people 2,000 years ago, which would be difficult to send a survey to that sample. And so this gives us some really nice insight into how these things may vary across cultures, and also how they may in fact be pretty general across cultures as well. And finally, in theme with a lot of what people have been doing and talking about here, we're trying to figure out how people acquire these maps in the first place. So on the top here, you can see some ground truth, just simulated transitional probability matrices between a set of arbitrary numbered states. And you can see the learned proximities within a map that's been trying to learn to accurately capture these transitional probabilities using a geometric configuration of states within some map. And we're currently in the process of trying to test whether this model is a good approximation for what people actually acquire when they are presented with these transitional probabilities in a fun experiment involving landing on an alien world and observing some alien creatures. So ideally, this can give us some idea of why these particular maps happen to form, why they have the dimensionality that they do, and why people may have certain biases in the types of predictions that they make as well. And with that, I'll wrap up by thanking my advisors, Diana and Jason, my collaborators, and the rest of the Princeton Social Neuroscience Lab, and the various organizations which made all this possible. Of course, all of you for your kind attention. Happy to take any questions. Yes, Ida.
So, one thing I'm still not sure about is that the specific way that we categorize states, for instance, or traits, was this just a way to categorize existing sort of data, or does it actually already predict something? Maybe I zoned out, you showed some predictions that worked, but predictive power to this particular way compared to another model that categorize things differently?
So you're talking about like model comparisons between like these sets of dimensions versus other sets of dimensions, or are you talking about like?
Big ones, but yeah, the specifics, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, you're right. I sort of didn't talk too much about that side of things during this particular talk. So we have done a lot of comparisons between particularly the sort of synthesized sets of dimensions, which I presented as sort of our final maps here, and the original theories that are out there in the literature from which we derived those dimensions. It's not a completely fair comparison because, yeah, exactly. I think, we went into this research, honestly, with the idea of doing a lot of model comparison, and where we ended up was a lot of dimensionality reduction, because a lot of these theories are making very similar predictions. So it's difficult to tease them apart and to see differences between them a lot of the time. So I think we're trying to basically, instead of pitting them against one another, just summarize them in the most efficient form we can a lot of the time.
Right, okay, that's the question I got. So
Yeah.
so I guess there was two dimensions to my question.
Yeah.
One was about comparing to other possibles.
Right.
The other thing was about the fact that it does seem like a descriptive summary categorization kind of thing. Was there any predictive power so far?
So, I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by prediction. So in a very trivial sense of like out-of-sample prediction, certainly we can, fit a model to some data and predict held-out data from one of these neural data sets, for example. Yeah, it should be true whenever you have a good statistical relationship between things. I think there's other types of prediction that you can talk about. So one example would be generalizing from like the data we've talked about here to like other ways of measuring how people think and feel about these stimuli. So I think the generalization from like neural prediction to text-based prediction is one example of that. Yeah, and so we've looked at behavior. For example, you could think about one way of thinking about the experience sampling data set is showing that it's predictive of the way that people are actually experiencing co-occurrences or transitions within their everyday experience of actions. That's probably where people are learning these statistical regularities in the first place, is my impression. There's also judgments that are more explicit about, for example, which of two mental states is more similar to a third, which you can predict quite accurately based on the proximities between those particular mental states, for example, on these dimensions. So those are some examples, but maybe I'm not quite answering your question. We can talk about it later if you want. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it would be really interesting to try to map your action space
Mm-hmm.
onto like actual physical spaces that we inhabit. There are lots of models that are, I guess there are models of what kind of actions you can perform in a particular location or what you normally do.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would be really interesting to see how the action space predicts like where we put things in a local environment and like gradually as that scales up to a community structure and whether that's going to relate at all to features of that community.
Yeah.
We'll get to Ida's point as well. Like where can this model
Take us. Yeah. I absolutely agree with you. We looked at it in a very coarse way so far, which is location defined as either outdoor, indoor public, or indoor private, and we can predict sort of which of those different locations a particular action is more or less likely to take place in. But I think it would be fascinating to do it on a much more, fine-grained actual physical space. And yeah, I think it'd be reasonable to expect that you could predict some of that based on these dimensions. Yes?
I had another question that relates to the class idea. And maybe I'm misunderstanding, but in some of your plots about state transitions, it looked like Lowe's values that we predicted were at like 20%.
Yeah.
If you have more than 5 classes, that doesn't make any sense.
People are not calibrated statistically well in that sense. People's like transitional probabilities also don't add up to like 100 or anything like that. I think it's
Way off.
it's definitely way off. People are normative. People are accurate in a relative way, not in like an actually like precise mathematical way, I'd say. So people have an ordinal, I'd say, representation of these things. Whether they're precise, I think part of it depends on like, what the percentage transition is to a particular class of mental states depends on like how many classes you assign, and that was determined not by us in these cases, but by the experience sampling data, which we happen to have access to. There may be more or less sort of implicit classes within somebody's mind, and that may be to some extent determining what probabilities they're reading out. Also, I was only showing you item analyses, so individual participants would give lower ratings than 20%, but the lowest average would be 20% across people. That includes some people who are probably just like randomly clicking or hitting the midpoint of the scale every time because it's mTurk. Yeah. Yes?
So I think that people represent more than transition probabilities. So I think, is it possible to measure like the probability of some action, some temporal order of actions, or some like co-occurrence rate?
Right, so co-occurrences and transitional probabilities are pretty correlated as far as we've seen, but sequential information is something we're really interested in because that also gets to that question of like asymmetries, which I was talking about earlier. I think we need some slightly different methods to start to get at that in a better way, but it is definitely something we want to look at. And I think that starting to think about not just sort of the static positions within these spaces as predictive, but also the trajectories through these spaces, as, for example, Daniela's talk sort of illustrated in the case of traits, is a nice way to think about, for example, like, is there momentum within the action space where if you're going in a certain direction, not only your position, but your direction vector is going to predict where you end up next, and that could help to explain why some transitions are more or less likely than the other, even if they're symmetrically distant from the current location. I think we...
Thank Mark.
Thank you.